They called him Jack the Ripper. Hello, everyone. The story of the serial killer known as Jack the Ripper is one of the most mysterious and infamous murder cases in all of history. It has inspired countless books, movies, television programs, and novels over the years. The locations where the crimes happened have even become tourist attractions in London, with visitors coming from all over the world to walk the same streets where Jack and his victims once were. In the year 1888, a series of some of the most brutal murders imaginable took place in London. The killer was believed to be a disturbed man with no clear motive for his actions. Most people believe that Jack the Ripper murdered 5 victims known as the Canonical 5. However, others argue that he may have killed at least 11 people. The 5 canonical victims were all poor women who worked in prostitution in the Whitechapel district. At the time, the public was terrified because the police failed to identify the killer responsible for these crimes. Despite extensive investigations, no one was ever able to determine who he truly was. The mystery became so serious that even the head of police and the Home Secretary eventually resigned from their positions. Many women in Whitechapel turned to prostitution simply to survive. One of those women was Mary Ann Nichols, the first official victim of the serial killer known as Jack the Ripper. Mary Nichols had once worked as a domestic servant in London, but because of her heavy drinking, she struggled to keep any job for long. After losing her last job, she moved into a shared lodging house designed for the poor. Sometime after moving there, specifically on August 30th, 1888, Mary was having a particularly difficult night. She didn't have the money needed to pay for her bed that night. So at around 11 p.m., she left the building and walked through the streets of Whitechapel, hoping to earn the money through prostitution. A friend of hers named Ellen Holland ran into her on the street. Ellen tried to convince Mary to come back home with her because it was already very late. It was approaching 1 in the morning, but Mary didn't care and left Ellen behind because she was drunk. Just 1 hour after that encounter, Mary's body was discovered. A prostitute being murdered in Whitechapel was not entirely unusual at the time. What was unusual was the way Mary had been killed. Her throat had been completely cut, and her abdomen was ripped open with her organs exposed outside her body. This was not just a simple murder. It was murder combined with horrifying mutilation. On September 8th, about a week after the first crime, the body of Annie Chapman was discovered. Annie Chapman had a lot in common with Mary Nichols. She also struggled with alcohol addiction. She lived in a lodging house as well. And just like Mary, she worked as a prostitute. Just like Mary, Annie was found with her throat cut and her abdomen open with her organs outside her body. But this time the killer did something even more disturbing. After killing her, he placed some of her organs on her right shoulder and some on her left shoulder. When the medical examiner performed the autopsy, they discovered that part of her uterus was missing. It appeared the killer had taken it with him as a souvenir. The medical examiner, Dr. George Baxter Phillips, stated that the murderer seemed to have some form of medical knowledge. He had removed the organ with unusual precision. In that same month, on September 27th, the Central News Agency received a letter from someone claiming to be the killer. The letter read, "Dear boss, I keep hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet." The writer mocked the police and said he laughed when they pretended they were on the right track. He even mentioned a man named John Pizer, who had been accused earlier, saying the accusation made him laugh. The writer then said he hated prostitutes and would continue cutting them up until he was caught. He also claimed that his last job had been a fine piece of work and that he didn't give the woman time to scream. He asked how the police could possibly catch him. He said he loved his work and wanted to start again soon. He even claimed he had taken some of the victim's blood in a bottle to use as ink for writing the letter. But he said the blood thickened like glue and couldn't be used, so red ink would have to do instead. The writer threatened that next time he would cut off the woman's ears and send them to the police officers just for fun. He asked them not to publish the letter until he had done more work. The letter ended with the signature, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper." He also wrote that he didn't mind being called by that name. The letter was not actually published until October 1st. Some people believe the letter was a hoax written by journalists trying to sell newspapers. But once it was published, the name Jack the Ripper immediately stuck with the public. From that moment on, the unknown killer of the Whitechapel murders became known forever as Jack the Ripper. Just 3 days after the letter incident, in the early hours of September 30th, the third crime occurred. But this time the killer didn't strike just once. 2 murders happened in the same night. A cart driver named Louis Dimeschutz was traveling through the streets of Whitechapel with his horse and cart. As he passed through a dark, narrow alley, he noticed something strange on the ground. When he climbed down from the cart and walked closer, he discovered the body of the third victim, Elizabeth Stride. Unlike the previous 2 victims, her body was not mutilated. Her throat had been cut and blood was still flowing. Her body was still warm, which meant she had been killed only moments before Dimeschutz discovered her. It appeared the sound of the approaching cart had frightened the killer and forced him to flee before completing his usual mutilations. But it seemed the unfinished crime did not satisfy him, because only about 45 minutes later, another body was discovered about a mile away in Mitre Square. The victim was Catherine Eddowes. Just like the previous victims, her throat had been cut and her abdomen opened with her organs removed. But this time the killer removed her left kidney and most of her uterus. He also mutilated her face severely. However, this crime contained a new piece of evidence. Police found a piece of Catherine Eddowes' blood-stained apron in Golston Street. Written in chalk above it on the wall was a message that said the Jews were not the men who would be blamed for nothing. The message seemed to imply that a Jewish person might be responsible for the murders. However, it was never proven whether the killer actually wrote it. Whitechapel walls at the time were already filled with graffiti. To prevent possible riots against Jewish residents in the area, Police Commissioner Charles Warren ordered the writing erased before sunrise. Shortly afterward, on October 1st, police received another letter from someone claiming to be Jack the Ripper. The handwriting looked similar to the previous letter. The letter stated, "I was not joking when I said you'd hear from me again soon." The writer said the first woman screamed a little, but he didn't have enough time to finish his work. He also said he didn't have time to cut off her ears to send to police. He thanked them for not publishing his earlier letter until he had done more work. The letter ended again with the signature Jack the Ripper. For the next 2 weeks, police searched nearly every home in the area, but they found nothing useful. Then, on October 16th, George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a small box. Inside the box was a letter and half of a human kidney preserved in alcohol. The letter was titled, "From Hell." The message read, "Mr. Lusk, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman." The writer claimed he had fried and eaten the other half, and said it tasted very nice. He added that if Lusk waited a little longer, he might send the knife he used as well. The letter ended with the words, "Catch me when you can." Reports said the kidney resembled the one removed from Catherine Eddowes, but without modern DNA testing, it was impossible to confirm. Some believed it was nothing more than a cruel prank by a medical student. About 3 weeks later, the final known victim was discovered. This time, the victim was younger than the others. Mary Jane Kelly was only 25 years old, while the other victims were over 40. Like the others, she also worked as a prostitute. But unlike the others, she was not murdered on the street. She was killed inside the room she rented. This gave the killer time to carry out his most horrifying mutilations yet. The last person known to have seen Mary Jane Kelly alive was a man named George Hutchinson. Around 2 a.m., Kelly had asked him to lend her 6 pence. Hutchinson said he didn't have the money. Kelly then walked away. From a distance, Hutchinson saw her speaking with a strange man. She took the man by the arm and walked with him toward the street where she lived. Hutchinson described the man as well-dressed and clean, appearing to belong to a higher social class. He wore a coat trimmed with fur, a long black tie, black leather boots, and a vest with a gold chain attached. This description later contributed to the theory that the killer might have come from the upper class. The next morning, Mary Jane Kelly's body was discovered. Her landlord, John McCarthy, sent his assistant, Thomas Bowyer, to collect the rent she owed. Around 10:45 in the morning, Bowyer knocked on her door but received no answer. After waiting for a while, he looked through a broken window that had been covered with cloth. Through the gap, he saw Kelly's body lying on the bed, horribly mutilated. He immediately ran to notify the police. The landlord later said that the sight was something he would never forget. He believed that only a devil could have done such a thing. Kelly's body was lying in the middle of the bed. Her throat had been cut down to the spine. Her face was mutilated so badly that she was almost unrecognizable. Just like the other victims, her abdomen had been opened and her organs removed. But this time her heart was missing entirely from the scene. Newspapers at the time suggested the killer must have had medical knowledge. However, the medical examiner, Dr. Thomas Bond, disagreed. Despite disagreements among researchers, Mary Jane Kelly is considered the final confirmed victim of Jack the Ripper. The murder suddenly stopped after her death. Many theories suggest the killer may have died, emigrated, been imprisoned, or become insane. The crimes placed the London police under enormous pressure. They had no experience dealing with this type of serial killer. Investigators found almost no evidence left behind. The murders also occurred in one of the most dangerous areas of London. Distrust between Whitechapel residents and the police slowed the investigation significantly. Hundreds of letters were sent to police and newspapers from people claiming to be Jack the Ripper. Most were likely hoaxes from people trying to create panic or journalists trying to sell newspapers. At first, police suspected the crimes might have been committed by a local gang controlling prostitutes in the area. They thought the gang might have been punishing women who refused to obey them. This theory was partly inspired by an earlier attack. On April 4, 1888, a woman named Emma Smith was assaulted in the street. Her face was injured and part of her ear was cut. Some people believe she may have been the first victim of Jack the Ripper. However, she survived the attack. When questioned, she said 2 or 3 men had attacked her, not just one. Because of that, police abandoned the gang theory. They began focusing on the idea of a single killer acting alone. In 1903, Sir Melville Macnaghten, the head of the Criminal Investigation Department, narrowed the suspect list to 3 men. However, many people believe there were far more possible suspects. The first major suspect was John Pizer. He was a Polish-Jewish shoemaker living in Whitechapel. Locals claimed he often threatened prostitutes who refused to give him money. Despite fitting some descriptions, he had alibis placing him elsewhere during the final murders. Another suspect was George Chapman, also born in Poland. He had trained as a surgeon before moving to the United Kingdom in late 1887 or early 1888. During the murders, he worked as a barber in Whitechapel. Inspector Frederick Eberlein considered him a strong suspect. Chapman's wife told police he often disappeared at night for long periods. However, there was no direct evidence linking him to the Ripper murders. Later in life, Chapman poisoned and murdered 3 of his wives. In 1903, he was executed by hanging. But experts still doubt he was Jack the Ripper because he preferred poison rather than violent mutilation. Another suspect was Francis Tumblety. He was an Irish-American con artist who pretended to be a doctor selling herbal medicines in America and Canada. One of his patients died from his treatments in Boston. He visited Europe frequently and stayed in a boarding house in Whitechapel during the murders. Police suspected him because he was known to hate women, especially prostitutes. He also reportedly collected preserved female organs as curiosities. He was arrested in London in November 1888 on charges related to indecency, which was a crime at the time. But he fled to New York before police could investigate further. American newspapers speculated about his possible connection to the murders. Another suspect was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant who arrived in England around 1880. He worked as a barber in Whitechapel during the time of the murders. Police suspected him because he suffered from severe mental illness. After the final murder, Kosminski was committed to a mental asylum where he remained until his death in 1919. He suffered from auditory hallucinations and paranoia. For many years, police considered him one of the most likely suspects. More than a century later, new claims emerged. In 2007, author Russell Edwards purchased a shawl at an auction believed to belong to Catherine Eddowes. The scarf was reportedly stained with blood from the crime scene. Edwards worked with a molecular biologist from Liverpool to analyze DNA on the scarf. They compared the DNA with living relatives of Eddowes and Kosminski. The results were announced as a match. Edwards publicly claimed he had solved the mystery. However, scientists later pointed out a major flaw. The genetic marker used in the comparison appears in about 1 out of every 290,000 people. At first, that seemed extremely rare, but later analysis suggested the marker might actually exist in up to 99% of Europeans, depending on interpretation. This meant that DNA evidence could belong to almost anyone. Another suspect was Montague John Druitt. He was a lawyer whose relatives included several doctors. Some believe he had an interest in surgery. He lived near the area where the murders occurred. Shortly before the killings began, his mother had been committed to an asylum. In his personal writings, Druitt expressed fear that he might go insane like her. Sir Melville Macnaghten later wrote that Druitt's own family suspected him. In December 1888, shortly after the final murder, his body was found floating in the River Thames. The murders stopped after his death, which increased suspicion. The final suspect we'll talk about today is Joseph Barnett. He was the man living with Mary Jane Kelly, the final victim. Barnett loved Kelly and even told people she was his wife, though they were not married. He hated that she worked as a prostitute. He tried to earn enough money so she wouldn't have to continue that work. At times, Kelly did stop working while living with him, but when Barnett lost his job and money became scarce, Kelly returned to prostitution. The couple eventually had a violent argument that broke a window in their room. Barnett moved out shortly afterward. 10 days later, Mary Jane Kelly was murdered. The crime scene suggested she had been killed while asleep. Her clothes were folded beside the bed, and she was wearing night clothes. There was no sign of forced entry into the room. This led some people to believe the killer had already been inside with her. The murders also stopped after Kelly's death. Some believe that if Barnett was the killer, he might have been committing the crimes to scare Kelly away from prostitution. But after killing her in a moment of rage, he no longer had a reason to continue. And that brings us back to the question that still remains unanswered today. Who really was Jack the Ripper? Was it one of these suspects, or someone the police never even considered? Was the killer reading the newspapers at the time, laughing while his hands were still stained with blood? That mystery remains unsolved to this very day. And that brings us to the end of today's story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with anyone who might enjoy this kind of content. And I'll see you next time with an even more chilling story. Goodbye.